I was night fishing the way most people doom scroll, just a mindless habit I fall into when life feels too loud. And that's how I ended up alone on the north side of Miller Reservoir at 1 a.m, sitting on a folding chair in the dark with a headlamp, 2 rods, and a gas station coffee that already tasted burnt, staring at black water I thought I knew better than any place on earth. Miller isn't some scenic postcard lake. It's an old flood control reservoir behind a closed campground and a rusted chain link fence. And if you park by the maintenance road and walk the tree line, you can slip in on the north bank where the wardens never bother checking, which I've been doing since high school without anything worse than a warning, so it felt like my spot, my rules, my little pocket of quiet where the worst thing that could happen was getting skunked. The night started normal. A light breeze, faint highway noise, crickets screaming, the usual rustling in the trees that you stop flinching at after a few seasons, because it's always deer or raccoons, never anything that cares. You're there. I set 1 rod heavy with cut bait for catfish and leaned it in a holder, then worked a jig with the other, slow hops across bottom for walleye, half fishing and half zoning out. Time went elastic like it always does on the bank. I checked my phone expecting I'd killed an hour and saw only 20 minutes gone, sighed, took another sip of burnt coffee, and kept working the jig. Around midnight, a thin skin of fog started sliding in off the water. Not the thick horror movie kind, just low sheets drifting like smoke. And when I turned off my headlamp to let my eyes adjust, it actually made it easier to see the dim starlight on the surface. I fished through fog plenty of times, but this felt different right from the start because everything else shut up at the exact same second. Crickets, frogs, even the distant hum of the highway seemed to pull back, and the breeze died so perfectly it was like someone had closed a door on the whole reservoir. You spend enough nights outside and you learn to trust that full body prickle when it hits, the way the air suddenly feels thick and attentive. And I remember sitting there with my rod in my hand, barely breathing, telling myself to knock it off while every hair on my arm stood straight up like I'd rubbed them on a balloon. Before I could decide whether to pack it in, the anchored rod in the holder snapped toward the water so hard the butt jumped out of the fork, dragged screaming, and I almost face-planted trying to grab it. Whatever was on the other end was just marching away with my line like it didn't care that I existed. At first I was excited because I've pulled decent cats out of Miller, but nothing that runs like that. And for 30 seconds I was grinning like an idiot, thinking personal best, while I leaned back and let it take line. But then the feeling in the blank registered and my stomach went cold. It wasn't head shaking or darting. It was just pure, grinding weight, like hooking the bumper of a truck that happened to be rolling downhill. I cranked the drag a quarter turn and dug my boots into the gravel, backing up the little peninsula while the rod arced into a ridiculous sea that it was absolutely not rated for. And I kept flicking my eyes to the line entry on the surface, counting down to when I should see a swirl or at least some disturbance. That's when I realized the surface where my line hit the lake didn't look like the rest. It was darker, not shadow dark, but absence of light dark, a palm-sized patch that soaked up what little starlight there was, instead of reflecting it. And as I watched it, still fighting whatever I'd hooked, that patch started sliding closer to shore in a straight line with my line like it was attached. The old part of my brain started yelling that this was wrong in a way the fishing part couldn't explain, but my arms were burning, my shoulder was locked, and I told myself it was some oil slick or weird current, anything except what my eyes were telling me, which was that the water right in front of me was turning into a hole. The fish stopped running all at once, and the line went slack just enough that I lurched forward, thinking it had spit the hook. So I reeled as fast as I could, and felt the weight again, but now it was straight down off the ledge, maybe 10, 12 feet from my boots, just on the edge of the drop-off where the bank falls into the old river channel. The fog had thickened into low clumps that hugged the surface, but that patch stayed perfectly clear and perfectly black, maybe the size of a pickup hood now, and I could see my line cutting straight into it. I took one careful step forward, boots grating on wet rock, and the second my front foot got close to the edge, everything on the other end of that line yanked down like it had been waiting. It didn't pull away like a spooked fish. It dropped like a trap door, and the force was so sudden it ripped my back foot off the rock and slid me forward. My lead boot plunged into the water up to the ankle, shock cold and sucking, and my body started going with it. I can't even take credit for being smart in that moment. It was pure panic reflex. I slammed my thumb onto the reel's quick release and let the whole setup go before the rod could lever me face first into the lake, and I watched it vanish in one smooth motion, butt, handle, guides, tip, all dragged under with barely a ripple, like the surface just swallowed it. I landed on my side hard enough to knock wind out of myself, gravel grinding into my palm and hip, and for a second I just lay there staring at that patch, expecting a splash, foam, something, but the only sound was this low, wet gulp, not loud but wrong, like hearing a drain clear under concrete. Then came the smell. Lakes have their own funk, algae, dead shad, mud, but this was different. Heavy and chemical and old, like someone had opened a sealed basement full of mold and rusted metal right under my nose. It burned behind my eyes and settled in the back of my throat like I'd swallowed bad water. So the fog swirled once over that black patch, and then, bit by bit, the contrast faded until it was just water again, flat and boring, and the chorus of insects eased back in like someone was slowly sliding the volume dial up. If it hadn't taken a rod I'd spent real money on, I could have convinced myself I'd just dumped a big carp and freaked myself out. But the empty rod holder and the drag marks in the gravel said otherwise. I didn't even bother with the other rod, just folded the chair with shaking hands, stuffed everything into the backpack, and started up the path, breaking the rule I never break out there. Don't look back. Of course I did. Halfway to the tree line, I stopped and glanced over my shoulder through a gap between the branches, and I could still see most of the reservoir, pale fog riding low over it, except for a new blotch farther out toward the center. Way bigger than before, maybe the size of a parking lot. Just sitting there, like a void in the middle of the lake. No starlight, no shoreline reflection, nothing. While I was staring, something pale slid up right on the edge of it and then slipped under again. My brain tried to label it a bird, a log, trash, anything. But the motion was all wrong, too controlled, too much like a hand feeling for the edge of a hole. I turned and forced myself not to run, even though every instinct wanted me sprinting. Running on that trail at night is a good way to eat a root and knock your teeth out. And the idea of lying there helpless while something in that water listened felt worse than walking fast, with my heart pounding in my ears. When I got to the car, I tossed my gear inside without even collapsing the remaining rod, slammed the doors, and only then realized I'd driven in with my dome light, disabled because I thought it looked cooler to roll in dark. I sat there in the pitch black of my own car for a second, too spooked to move, then fumbled the keys into the ignition and got the hell out, headlights scraping the trees as I bounced back onto the main road. I went back the next afternoon because that's what stubborn idiots do when something scares them. They try to rationalize it away. Sun high, kids yelling on the official swim beach, pontoon boats dragging tubes. The whole lake looked shallow and harmless and stupid. And from the main lot, you'd never believe that 12 hours earlier, it had felt like standing next to an open throat. I walked the maintenance road, cut through the trees, and stepped onto the point, half expecting my missing rod to be propped right where I dropped it, like some park ranger had found it and left a ticket. There was nothing. No rod, no line, just a gouged line in the damp gravel where something heavy had been dragged those last few feet before disappearing, ending at the exact rock my boot had slipped on. I forced myself to stand there for a while, counting out the depth in my head, cataloging every log and stump in sight, telling myself there had to be some natural explanation, some submerged current, some fault in the bottom structure that created weird pressure. but every theory sounded dumber than the last. I still fish, just not there and not at night. When people ask why I gave up my honey hole, I joke about getting too old to pull all-nighters or say the drive isn't worth it, and they nod and laugh and tell me I'm missing out because the walleye bite is still good. I don't tell them that every time I pass Miller on the highway and the fog is sitting low, I catch myself looking for a patch of darkness that doesn't behave like water, or that sometimes when I'm standing on a perfectly safe dock on a different lake, I feel a phantom tug on my boots like something deep remembers my weight standing on the edge of that drop and is still annoyed it only got a rod that night instead of me. I used to think night fishing was the safest kind of escape. No bars, no traffic, no strangers, just you, your boat, and whatever decides to bite. That belief died on a Friday in October, on a lake I'd fished since middle school. I'll call it Harper Lake. Locals know it as the place you go when you want quiet and don't want to be bothered. One boat ramp, one gravel lot, a broken streetlight, and a dark tree line that eats headlight beams. I'd been out there dozens of times alone. I work maintenance at a warehouse, so by the end of the week, all I want is to be somewhere I don't have to answer to anyone. Harper was perfect for that. No houses on the shore, no wake boats, no campground. Just water, hills, and an old dam at the far end. That night, the forecast was clear. Light wind, temps dropping into the low 50s. Perfect for fall bass. I pulled into the lot around 7:45 p.m. Mine was the only truck. The orange security light that sometimes flickered over the ramp was dead, leaving everything lit only by my headlights and a thin strip of after-sunset glow over the hills. I remember thinking it felt extra empty, but that's what I liked, so I didn't question it. I launched my little aluminum John boat, killed the big motor halfway down the lake, and switched to the trolling motor to work a rocky point. For the first hour, it was normal. Crickets loud, some frogs in the shallows, the occasional car out on the county road above the far bank. I missed a good hit right at the boat and laughed at myself out loud. It was the kind of night that makes you forget anything bad exists off the water. Then the sound cut. Not faded. Cut, one cast. I had a full background noise track. Bugs, frogs, wind in the pines, faint highway hum. Mid-retrieve, I realized I could hear my reel gears turning. I stopped reeling and listened. Nothing. No bugs, no frogs, no breeze. Even my ears felt like they were plugged. I know lakes change mood at night, but this felt wrong, like the whole place was holding its breath. I told myself a front was moving in. I'm not proud of it, but I started talking to myself just to put some noise back in the air. I said something stupid like, "All right, one more pass, then we'll head in." My voice sounded strange and flat, like it soaked into the dark instead of bouncing back. I set my rod down and bent to grab my headlamp. Before I could click it on, something hit the side of the boat. The John boat jumped under me hard enough that my knee cracked the bench seat. It wasn't a log. I know what that feels like. This hit had weight and direction to it, like someone had kicked the hull from underneath. I froze, one hand on the headlamp strap. "Carp," I said automatically, out loud again. "Just a carp." The lake didn't answer. No rings, no splash after. Just the faint tap of water against aluminum. I turned the headlamp on and swept the beam along the surface. The cone of light stretched maybe 30 feet in front of the bow, catching only black water and the vague concrete slope of the dam in the distance. No floating log, no trash, no obvious reason for the hit. I told myself not to be dramatic, sat back down, and picked up my rod. That's when the trolling motor turned by itself. The foot pedal was at my right foot. I hadn't touched it. The motor at the bow hummed, turned a few degrees, then started pulling the boat with a slow, steady push. The bow swung away from the shoreline I'd been working and aimed toward the dark middle of the lake. I lifted my foot and checked the pedal like an idiot, as if there was any chance my boot was on it without me noticing. It wasn't. The speed knob was set low, exactly where I'd left it. The motor kept humming. It felt like somebody invisible had one hand on the nose of the boat and was guiding it where they wanted it. I stomped the power switch. The hum died. The boat drifted in the silence. Something splashed behind me. I spun on the bench, nearly losing my balance. It wasn't a small fish tick. It was the heavy, abrupt whoomp of something big breaking the surface and dropping back down. 2 seconds later, another splash. A little closer. Then a third one. Closer still. I grabbed my handheld spotlight from under the seat, thumbed it on, and swept the beam through the dark. Ripples spread and faded. For half a second, the light passed over a pale shape just under the surface, round with 5 lighter streaks. My brain labeled it hand, before the beam slipped off and it disappeared. I dragged the light back to where it had been. Nothing. Just black water. No head, no arm, no log. My heart had jumped into my throat. I'm not somebody who jumps to ghost or monster. I grew up around this lake. I've seen all kinds of stupid stuff. Drunk kids diving from rocks at night, deer swimming across coves, enormous carp rolling in the half-dark. My mind tried to shove what I'd just seen into one of those boxes and failed. The hair on my arms was standing straight up. That was enough for me. I flipped the spotlight off so I didn't blind myself, turned and yanked the pull cord on the outboard like my life depended on it. First pull, cough, die. Second pull, nothing. Third pull, it caught, idling rough and loud in the dead quiet. I didn't even sit down. I just dropped onto the rear seat, threw it in gear, and pointed the bow roughly toward where I thought the ramp was. I hadn't gone 50 yards when something grabbed the left side of the boat. There's no better word for it. The John boat lurched sideways so fast the right gunnel dipped to within inches of the water. The motor bogged, like we'd suddenly hit mud, but the depth finder read 30 feet. For 1 second, the boat hung there, tilted, everything inside me screaming that if I moved wrong, we'd flip. My left hand slapped flat against the aluminum, right where the hull met the lake. Under my palm, I felt something tap twice from below. Dry. Hard. The exact sound of knuckles knocking on thin metal. I yanked my hand back like I'd burned it, shoved the throttle down harder, and leaned my weight to the right. Whatever had hold of us let go. The boat snapped upright and surged forward. I didn't think. I didn't look back. I kept my eyes on the vague outline of the hill where I knew the ramp had to be, and held that line like it was the only solid thing left in the world. It felt like it took an hour to get there. In reality, it was maybe 3 minutes. My heart didn't know the difference. When the concrete of the ramp finally appeared as a pale stripe in the headlamp's reach, I cut the motor too late and rammed the bow straight up onto the first few feet of cement. The impact threw me forward, bruised my ribs, and probably took some paint off the hull. I didn't care. I jumped out, boots splashing in the shallows, grabbed the bowline, and dragged the boat up until it grated dry on rock. Only then did I turn around and look back at the lake. It was completely still. No ripples, no mist. Just a flat black sheet reflecting a few stars and the faint glow from the highway over the hill. And then, as if someone had turned a dial, the crickets started up again. Frogs croaked. A breeze moved through the trees and leaves hissed against each other. Sound returned exactly the way it had left. All at once. I stood there in ankle-deep water, breathing hard, with that stupid spotlight hanging from my wrist and the boat line cutting into my hand, and tried to tell myself I just scared myself for no reason. Log, fish, bad wiring, overactive imagination. Pick one. Anyone. I drove home white-knuckled and didn't tell a soul. I tried to push it away. For 2 weeks I stayed off Harper completely. Even now I can't stand it when the house goes quiet all at once. It feels too much like that lake holding its breath again. I'm sending this one because it's the first time I've ever been fishing and genuinely thought I'd found a dead body. And the worst part is, I'm still not totally convinced I didn't. This happened 2 summers ago on a small, barely known creek in rural Missouri called Alder Run. It's narrow, shallow, and mostly ignored except by people who bow fish or set limb lines for flatheads. I go there when I want absolute silence. No boat traffic, no campers, no noise, just water and trees. The whole place feels a little forgotten, which I used to love. Not so much anymore. My friend Wes had told me about a deep pocket farther upstream where the creek bends under an old steel railroad bridge. He swore big flatheads held there all summer, and I'd never fished it. So one evening I loaded a rod, a bucket of live bluegill, and a headlamp into my truck and decided to check it out before dark. To get there, you have to park on the shoulder, climb down a small washed-out slope, and follow the creek upstream about half a mile until the trees swallow you completely. It's not a trail, just mud, roots, and spider webs that hit you right in the face, because the place never gets traffic. By the time I reached the bend, I was sweating and covered in burrs, but the spot looked perfect. Deep, slow water, a log jam on the far side, and the rusted frame of the old bridge overhead like something from a forgotten town. I rigged a bluegill onto a big circle hook, lobbed it to the shadow line, set my rod against a rock, and sat on the bank listening to the water slide around the bend. For a while it was peaceful. Birds settling in, frogs starting up, the distant hum of insects in the woods. I forgot the hike in. Honestly, I was enjoying myself. Then I heard something upstream, slow footsteps. Not an animal breaking brush, not a deer splashing. Human footsteps. Careful ones. I turned off my headlamp and just listened. They were steady, paced, and coming closer. I figured maybe someone else found the same spot, maybe another fisherman. But something felt off. No lights, no talking. Just footsteps stopping every few seconds, like whoever it was kept checking their footing or looking around. I stayed quiet. Eventually, the steps stopped right around the slight bend upstream, maybe 20 yards away, hidden behind a cluster of sycamores. I expected whoever it was to walk into view. They didn't. They just stopped. No movement, no splashing, nothing. That silence stretched long enough that I felt stupid sitting there, pretending not to notice. After another minute, the footsteps started again, but this time heading away from the water, deeper into the woods, and within seconds, the sound faded completely. I tried to shake it off and went back to watching my rod tip. 10 minutes later, the line twitched hard and I grabbed the rod, ready for a flathead. But the pull wasn't normal. It was slow, heavy, almost like dragging something through mud. When I set the hook, whatever was on the other end didn't fight. It just rose, dead weight, limp. My stomach dropped because I've snagged drowned deer before and they feel exactly like that. The line angled up toward the surface and I saw the shape break the water, pale, round, about the size of a human shoulder. I stumbled backward so hard I slipped in the mud. My headlamp hit the ground but didn't break, and when I flicked it on, the beam caught the thing drifting just under the surface. For the first second, I swear on everything it looked like a human back. Same skin tone, same curve, same stillness. I froze, gripping the rod like an idiot because part of me didn't want to reel it in and part of me couldn't let go. Then the current shifted and the object rolled slightly, just enough to see it wasn't flesh. It was rubber. A latex suit of some kind, waterlogged and filled with mud, shaped eerily like a torso. I reeled it in slowly and dragged it onto the bank. It was a wetsuit top, black, thick neoprene, but the inside was stuffed with wet leaves, mud, rocks, and something else that smelled metallic and rotten. And the biggest problem? It had been cut open from the neckline down to the stomach area with a blade. A clean cut, deliberate, not torn, not snagged, sliced. I stood there with this thing at my feet, heart punching my ribs, trying to understand why anyone would gut a wetsuit, stuff it, and dump it upstream. That's when I smelled the smoke. Wood smoke, fresh, close. Not a campfire, someone burning brush or trash. I turned off my headlamp instantly and crouched low. The smell was coming from upstream, the same direction the footsteps had gone. I listened, holding absolutely still. Crackling. A faint cough, something metallic clinking. I don't know why, but every instinct told me not to announce myself. I eased back toward the bushes, keeping low, rod still in hand, mud sucking at my boots. I heard something else then, a splash. Not small, not a fish. Something heavy being dropped into the water. Followed by footsteps again, quicker this time, moving away. I backed into the thicket so fast branches scraped my arms. I stayed hidden, barely breathing, until the footsteps faded for good. I should have left right then. I didn't. Curiosity or stupidity, maybe both, made me edge forward until I could barely see around the bend. Through the trees, I spotted a glow maybe 50 yards upstream, a small fire. Someone crouched next to it. They were feeding something into the flames, pieces of fabric, maybe paper. A duffel bag sat open beside them. I leaned too far, and a dry stick snapped under my boot. The person froze, head snapping up. They didn't call out. They didn't ask who was there. They just grabbed the duffel, kicked dirt onto the fire until it dimmed, and moved fast down a narrow trail that disappeared into the woods. I dropped flat behind the brush until I couldn't hear them anymore. After 5 long minutes, I stood up, adrenaline making my hands shake. I walked backward the entire time until I reached the slope by the road, then climbed out, half expecting someone to be waiting at the top. They weren't. My truck was exactly how I left it. I threw my gear in the back, locked the doors, and peeled out before I let myself breathe. The next morning, I called the county sheriff's office and told them I might have found illegal dumping in Alder Run. I didn't mention the footsteps, the fire, or the duffel. I didn't want to be involved if it was something worse. 2 days later, I drove past the same spot. There were tire tracks from law enforcement, and the path down to the creek was trampled. But the bend looked empty, clean, too clean. No wetsuit, no ashes, no disturbed mud, no signs anyone had been there at all. I told myself they must have picked everything up. It was easier to believe than the alternative, that someone came back that same night and cleaned their mess before authorities even arrived. I still fish, but I don't go back to Alder Run. Whenever someone mentions it or asks for directions, I just tell them it's overgrown and not worth the hike. I don't say that somewhere in those woods is a person who walks quietly, carries a duffel bag that burns, and drops things into water without wanting them found. And the worst part is I wasn't supposed to be there. I keep replaying the moment that stick snapped under my boot. How fast their head turned. How they didn't speak. How they just left. Like they weren't scared. Like they were annoyed they weren't alone. I don't know what I almost walked into. I just know I wasn't meant to see it.